The Lost Track of Time, Chapter 17. The shadow was so close, Penelope could almost touch it. Almost, but not quite. It was as if an invisible wall separating the two realms held it back. It swirled around and around, breaking apart and reforming, pressing against the bright nothing with an intensity that could only be described as hunger. Penelope shivered as 1,000 icy spiders ran up her neck. "I thought we were going to see the fancies," she said through chattering teeth. "And we are," trilled the great Moodler, completely unperturbed by the chilling darkness. "The little darlings should be here any minute. I really can't imagine anything tickling the fancies more than you breaking Kronos' spell." Penelope watched the shadow throw itself against the nothing, pummeling it with unsettling power, then retreating only to rush back again. "Is it safe here?" she asked. The great Moodler dismissed the writhing darkness with a wave of her hand. "Of course we're safe, completely beyond the shadow of doubt." "The shadow of doubt?" cried Penelope. "Is that what that is?" The great Moodler looked at Penelope in surprise. "What did you think it was?" Penelope shrugged. I don't know. Used to be the realm of impossibility was visible to everyone. All it took was a little moodling, and ping, there it was. But then Kronos appeared and cast doubt into everyone's mind. Now the shadow hovers over everything in the realm of possibility, and nobody knows the impossible is within reach, just beyond the shadow of doubt. That's why we've got to get those fancies. "But what else? What can the fancies do?" asked Penelope. As far as she was concerned, the fancies could hardly stay awake, much less fend off the shadow. "Oh ho ho ho," said the great Moodler, wagging her finger at Penelope. "Never underestimate the power of a fancy. They can do anything. To start with, they can lift the shadow." The great Moodler cupped one hand around her right eye and stretched out the other hand as if she were holding a spyglass. She moved the hand in front of her eye back and forth like she was focusing a lens. "I think I see one now." "Where?" Penelope scanned the sky. "Along the far horizon," said the great Moodler. "Oh dear, they're shrunken and half-starved. Just as I expected." She put her arms down and looked at Penelope, nodding toward the shadow. "See for yourself." Penelope stared at her. "Go on, then." The great Moodler nudged Penelope with her elbow. "Give it a try." Penelope lifted her hands as if she too were looking through a spyglass. She closed her left eye and squinted with her right until... Oh! There it was. The shadow seemed so close it was as if Penelope were standing right in front of it. A soft silvery haze directly above the shadow wavered and then moved. "I think I see something," Penelope said. "That's it. Keep looking," urged the great Moodler. Penelope kept her eye on the movement. It glimmered like dust caught in a shaft of sunshine. Small black dots swam here and there in the dim light. Suddenly, a pair of the black dots blinked. They were eyes. "I see one! I see one!" Penelope cried. Then she saw another, and another. The haze above the shadow wasn't a haze at all. It was a swarm of fancies. They moved like a flock of birds skimming over a dark sea. "There must be 1,000 of them," said Penelope breathlessly. As she watched, the fancies came to a halt, and then, as if they had choreographed the movement, they dove into the shadow and vanished. Penelope staggered back. What had happened to them? The great Moodler took a long look through her telescope. "Thank goodness," she muttered. "They're doing exactly what I hoped they would." Penelope couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You wanted them to dive into the shadow? They'll die." "They aren't going to die," said the great Moodler in a soothing voice. "Take a look for yourself." Looking at the shadow made Penelope feel like it would suck her in. But she did as she was told. She raised her hands to her face and used her spyglass to search for any sign of the fancies. Nothing disturbed the shadow's surface until she saw, out of the corner of her eye, a large chunk of darkness float past and fade into the light of the sun. To her surprise, a hole in the shadow appeared, and streaming out of it were the fancies. They were pushing and tugging at the shadow as they flew. Some had it by their toes. Others were butting it with their heads. Penelope turned to look at the Great Moodler. "They're lifting the shadow," she said in shock. The Great Moodler smiled an "I told you so" smile. "Never underestimate the power of a fancy," she repeated. "There's nothing they can't do. Of course, they'll wear themselves out with all that work, the little sweeties, but we'll just have to fatten them up so they can go back out and finish the job. If we both moodle on whatever tickles our fancy, we'll have a feast for them in no time." "Moodle?" Penelope squeaked. "But of course. It's the best way to feed your fancy." I can't," Penelope blurted out. "Nonsense," said the Great Moodler in the most matter-of-fact voice. "I'm sorry, but it isn't nonsense," insisted Penelope. "I used to be able to moodle all the time, but I told you all my ideas disappeared. They dried up or something." Penelope's voice trailed off. "My dear," countered the Great Moodler, "anyone who can break Kronos' spell isn't just full of ideas. She's full of possibilities." Penelope's heart skipped a beat. Her? Full of possibilities? It couldn't be true. "You don't understand," Penelope said with a shake of her head. "I tried to use the Moodle hat to find you, but I couldn't make the hat work. Nothing came to mind. Dill even called it a—" Penelope paused. She didn't want to say the word that had been hunting and haunting her ever since she'd heard it. But there was the Great Moodler looking at her, eyebrows raised, waiting for her to finish. Penelope rushed the words out of her mouth. "He called it an anomaly." "Exactly," said the Great Moodler with one big exaggerated nod of her head. Penelope took a step back. "Exactly? Exactly what? Don't you know what an anomaly is?" "It's a failure, isn't it?" Penelope asked. "Oh, goodness, no. Quite the opposite. An anomaly is an oddity, a quirk, a rarity. You are all those things, and I couldn't be more pleased." The Great Moodler beamed up at Penelope as if she'd won a prize. "You see, an ordinary person would have turned into a clockworker by now. But you figured out exactly where I was right from the start." Penelope's heart skipped. "I did? Didn't you say you moodled on my whereabouts and nothing came to mind?" The Great Moodler held out her arms to embrace the nothing all around. "Ta-da!" Penelope's jaw dropped. The truth of what the Great Moodler said slowly dawned on her. She remembered the gentle whirring of the hat and the bright, beautiful nothing that opened up inside her as she wore it. No wonder this place looked familiar. She had seen it before. "Do you mean I did come up with a big idea?" asked Penelope. "I knew where you were all along?" "Indeed," said the Great Moodler. "You're a first-rate moodler." Penelope still couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "My ideas aren't stuck, are they? I can still be a writer?" "Of course," said the Moodler. "Now then, let's get busy. We've got work to do. The fancies will be here any minute." The Great Moodler whirred around and plopped down into a non-existent chair. She pulled a Do Not Disturb sign out of the nothing and hung it above her head. After settling herself in more comfortably, she let out a deep humming sigh. As she did, small, brightly colored bubbles streamed out of her ears. Penelope watched as the bubbles danced back and forth, growing larger. "I'm free," thought Penelope. "All along, I thought I couldn't moodle, but I could. Miss Matty was right. All I needed was space. This space." Penelope felt a surge of excitement. She would help fatten up the fancies, free Dill, and save the Cuckoo's home. Save the entire realm. All she has to do was moodle. At that moment, a few fancies began to trickle into the realm of impossibility. They were pale and wan, shriveled by exertion. Penelope watched as they crowded around the bubbles streaming out of the Great Moodler's head, filling the air with their peeps and squeaks. One of the bubbles started to grow bigger and bigger until, pop! It broke into 1,000,000 pieces of light. The fancies sprang into action, swooping through the air and gobbling up the bright shards. The tiny creatures began to glow as the light danced in their stomachs, puffing them up and up until, poof! They let out a sound like a balloon losing all its air and spun wildly around. Once they came to a halt, they pounced on another morsel. After each bite, the fancies were bigger and brighter than before. They filled the sky, bobbing about like gigantic balloons. They were every color of the rainbow, and then some. They were so fat, so fluffy, that only the tips of their toes could be seen. Penelope picked a bit of light off her sleeve and examined it closely. There, glimmering in perfect clarity, were the words, "Fudge is a health food." "It's a possibility," said Penelope. Just then, a particularly energetic fancy swooped down and snatched it out of her hand. "Hey!" Penelope tried to snatch it back, but the fancy was too fast. It swallowed the possibility and set off to join the others with a loud burp. Penelope looked at the possibilities falling softly all around her. "I guess there's enough for everybody," she thought, and reached out to catch another one. A flash of light suddenly blinded her, and she shielded her eyes before, plunk, something soft landed on her chest and tumbled into the front pocket of her overalls. Penelope reached into her pocket and took out a tiny possibility. Squinting, she read the words, "You can do it." The possibility sent a shock through Penelope, and she let out a sharp gasp. The great Moodler popped one eye open. "What's all the fuss?" Penelope cupped her hand around the possibility, hiding it from any hungry fancies, and walked over to the great Moodler. "Take a look," she said, opening her hand ever so slightly. The great Moodler peered at it and then leaned back with a knowing smile. "You got a good one. That's what I call a least possibility. Very tiny, but very powerful. They can grow to be unusually large, if you really consider them. That possibility right there can take you all the way to the moon." She gave Penelope a wink. Penelope dropped the possibility back into her pocket. By now, more and more fancies were streaming into the realm. They scattered in every direction, looking for food. The great Moodler had returned to her moodling, and the air was full of bubbles, some of which had already begun to grow. Penelope heard a chirping sound and glanced up. An emaciated little fancy was buzzing around her head. "I'd better get busy," she thought. She sat down, crossed her legs, and took out her notebook. She'd been so caught up in trying to escape from the tower, she'd forgotten all about it. Opening it, she stared at a blank page. It was empty, full of nothing, just like the realm of impossibility. She took out her pencil and wrote about all the things that tickled her fancy. She wrote about drinking tea with the great Moodler, about following her hunch and discovering the no-time, about the timekeeper and the cuckoo, about everything she'd seen on her journey. A large group of fancies crowded around her, vying for spots over her shoulder. They munched hungrily, growing fatter by the moment, feasting on her every word. On and on she wrote. Here, in the realm of possibility, her words took flight above her head, coming to life as the story took shape. And as she wrote, time stood still, waiting patiently for her to finish. That's the end of chapter 17. See you next time.